Hey everyone, I'm John and welcome back to another episode of Bending and Breaking. Today we're diving into Song of Songs again to try and explore its storyline. So a little while ago I went over the issues with understanding it, and now we're going to put that all aside and just dive into what I think the story of it is. So if you're joining on the podcast, there's too many Bible references for me to read out. So if you're keen to know exactly what I'm referring to, you might want to check out the YouTube version of this. And on the YouTube version, I've got some pretty comprehensive slides as well to explain what I'm thinking and my view on this sort of stuff a bit more clearly. To set all of this in context, my view on the storyline of Song of Songs is probably the minority view. The majority view is probably something like there's two lovers and the love between the two lovers is expressed rightly. As in, the love that's expressed between the two of them is within the bounds of how God would want two people to express their love. My view is that there's three lovers, or that there's two lovers plus there's a third man, and there's a kind of love triangle between the three of them. And that the love that's expressed between them in all respects is illicit. And it's not how God would want us to express love between people. So, majority view, two lovers, rightly expressed. My view, three lovers, and an illicit affair. And the reason that there can be such wide-ranging views on Song of Songs is that the nature of the book itself gives us lots of room for interpretation. And there's at least three reasons for that. First is that the book is poetry or song, and by its nature, it speaks in ways that are hard to understand. It uses ambiguous language, it uses images which aren't always clear. So that in itself leaves it with lots of room for interpretation. The second reason, and it's really tied to the first one, is that there's very few clear markers of transitions, of context, of any sort of background. All of that's left really open, and none of that is very clearly defined in Song of Songs. And the third reason, which is probably tied to it being poetry as well, is that the voices, or who's speaking, is really ambiguous. At a guess, from my own translation, I'd say maybe 60% of the time you can be pretty sure who's speaking. And that leaves about 40% of the time where we're unsure who's speaking. And that obviously makes it really hard to interpret and understand what's going on. And then not only is who's speaking unclear, but also the person that they're speaking to is unclear, basically the whole time. So we often don't know who's speaking, and we pretty much never know who they're speaking to, at least with any certainty. And so those three things make Song of Songs a book that's really open for interpretation. And you can have almost contradictory interpretations, and it can be pretty reasonable when people go through their evidence. So because of all of that, I'll be just providing evidence for my own view. I'm not really going to speak about the other views and evidence for other views. There'll be plenty of counterpoints to what I present, and that's just kind of the nature of Song of Songs. So don't take this episode as the definitive interpretation of Song of Songs. Listen to my evidence, listen to my thoughts, and see if you agree with it or not, see if it changes your own thoughts a little bit. My breakup for Song of Songs is chapter 1, verse 1 is the title of the song. 1 verse 2 to verse 6 is a picture of love seeking or love's desires. 1 verse 7 to 2 verse 7 is love finding its desires. 2:8 to 3:5 is love loses. 3:6 to 5:1 is love unfetters. 5:2 to 16 is love returns. 6:1 to 8:4 is love dies. And then 8:5 to 8:14 is love teaches. So we'll go through all of that in detail, and then you'll get an idea of why I've called them those things. So firstly, chapter 1 verse 1, the title. Chapter 1 verse 1 reads, "The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's." I mentioned in the last episode that the phrase Song of Songs could have a couple of meanings, and the one that I think it means is that this is the greatest song of all songs. The second part of the verse, which says, which is Solomon's, is a bit more interesting to think about for right now. The word that's translated Solomon's, as in Solomon apostrophe S, is made up of the word Solomon plus the Hebrew lamed preposition. And the tricky thing about the lamed preposition is that it has a really broad range of meanings. So normally it means something like 2 or 4 or something like that. But especially when it's used in poetry, and especially when it's used in the titles of poems, it has a really unclear meaning. So in the context of the title of a poem, it could mean something more like in the style of, or regarding, or written by, or written about, or concerning, or something like that. It's got such a broad range. My guess, and this guess comes from my interpretation of the content of the song, so it is a bit of a circular argument, but my guess is that it means something like the Song of Songs, which is inspired by Solomon. And we'll get into a bit more why I think it's something like inspired by or in the style of Solomon. Okay, so let's dive into the content of the song. Chapter 1, verse 2 to 6, Love Seeks. So these first few verses really set up the backdrop of the song as physical desire. And I think the physical desire is really important because there's not many other places in the Bible that talk about this physicalness of desire and of love. The section is filled with verses like, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Draw me after you, will extol your love more than wine. So there's all these kind of physical sort of metaphors that come through the language of these first few verses, and it really carries through the whole song. And the main way it seems to express this physical desire is through imagery, and particularly nature imagery. So things like gardens and vines and animals. In chapter 1, verse 6, she says, they, as in her brothers, they made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I've not kept. And so this verse is really interesting and informative to us, because in the first part, she says, they made me keeper of the vineyards. Presumably that's physical vineyards. Then the second half she says, but my own vineyard I've not kept. And that could be physical vineyards as well, but it would be unlikely, I think, that she's referring to her own personal vineyard, which are separate from the vineyard of her family. More likely, I think, that she's gone from talking about something physical to something metaphorical. So in being forced to keep the vineyards and do hard labour, it's made her neglect her own vineyard, her own metaphorical vineyard, which right now is not explained to us, but as we go through Song of Songs, we can see she's talking about her physical desires. So in this verse, the physical vineyards are put next to her metaphorical vineyard. And that's really instructional because that's how Song of Songs communicates throughout the book. It talks about lots of these physical things in the real world, but it's meaning these metaphorical things that we kind of have to tease apart to understand. But this first section also sets up this undertone of struggle, and that will be revealed in different ways as we go throughout the song. But in the first section, it's kind of expressed as insecurity. So verse 6 says, do not gaze at me because I'm dark, because the sun has looked upon me. So in this section, she expresses all her physical desires, but at the same time, it expresses this struggle even within herself to achieve these physical desires that she's after. One final important thing that this section does is that it establishes the context of the song being sung. So we can tell that it's the lover speaking, and by the lover I mean the female voice is speaking. But she's not speaking right now directly to her beloved. She's actually speaking to the daughters of Jerusalem. And that's a really interesting context to start the song from, and I think it becomes really important as we get to the end of the song, and it fills in or explains some tricky parts as we get to the end. So chapter 1 verse 7 to 2 verse 7, love finds. Now we get to the point where the lover finally speaks to the beloved. And again, it's filled with nature imagery And that nature imagery, like lilies and roses and trees and fruit and foxes, are all metaphorically, as we saw before, speaking of physical things and physical desires particularly. So this whole section is just the lover and the beloved talking about each other and how much they love each other and what they love about each other. And basically, in the eyes of the beloved, the lover is the most beautiful amongst all women. And in the lover's eyes, the beloved is as a king. And all of this description of their physical love for each other ends or culminates in chapter 2, verse 6, where it says, "His left hand is under my head and his right hand embraces me." And this is basically why I think this is an illicit song. They spend this whole amount of time talking about their physical desire for one another. And it ends in this really suggestive verse, "His left hand is under my head and his right hand embraces me." I don't know how you can... Well, I think it's really difficult. I think the only way to understand this as a godly expression of love is to read in things. And you'd have to say something like, they came to this point, but they restrained themselves and they stayed apart. And that's what some people say with the final verse of this section, which says, "I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and the does of the field, that you do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases." So the people that see this as a good expression of love would say, look at verse 7 and see they've kind of stopped themselves from going too far. But in my interpretation, I would take all those verses before as their desire for each other and their intention to express those desires, those physical desires. And I would take verse 6 as just the culmination of that, where they give in to those desires and express it incorrectly. And then verse 7 I would take as a warning to the daughters of Jerusalem. So notice she's talking not to the beloved, not saying, let's stop this, but talking to the daughters of Jerusalem and saying, don't awaken love like we've just done. And so I read that as a warning that comes from having already expressed love and awakened love incorrectly before it pleases. The third section, chapter 2, verse 8 to 3:5, love loses. There's a pretty dramatic cut from the previous section. They were in each other's embrace 2 verses ago, but now in chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "Behold, he comes leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills." So the lover is now traversing across this mountainous terrain, some sort of barrier that separates them. Not only over the mountains, but then over the walls and gazing through windows and through the lattice. So there's all these barriers now, metaphorically, maybe physically as well, between the lover and her beloved. When the beloved finally traverses all these barriers, he says to his beloved, "The fig tree ripens its figs, and the vines are in blossom." Again, that nature metaphor as an expression for their physical desires for each other. But still, after traversing all those obstacles and getting to the point where the beloved can speak to the lover and call her out, there's still these obstacles in the way. So chapter 2, verse 15 says, "Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vineyards, for our vineyards are in blossom." So this section is really portraying kind of limitless barriers between the love of the beloved and the love of the lover. And it ends again with the beloved returning to the mountains. So verse 17 says, "Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, turn, my beloved, be like a gazelle or a young stag on cleft mountains." It's unclear if they've been able to fulfill their physical desires again or not. But basically, the beloveds come all the way over these mountains, over all these barriers. They've encountered foxes which are spoiling their love. And then in the end, the beloved has to return to the mountains again. And so the lover says in chapter 3, verse 1, "On my bed at night I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him but found him not." So she's lost her love now. Despite all those efforts that came before, he's had to return to the mountains and they're separated. And she gets up and she searches for him in the cities, and she actually finds him. She finds the one who her soul loves, and she says, I held him and I would not let him go. Chapter 3, verse 4. And then again, this section ends in another warning, again to the daughters of Jerusalem, not to the beloved, but to the daughters of Jerusalem. By the gazelles or the does of the field, I adjure you, do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. So again, I think that makes the most sense. To interpret this warning as a warning from the lover to the daughters of Jerusalem, not to awaken love like she has, because look at all these obstacles that their love has had to overcome. All these things that have gotten in their way, because they've awakened love before it pleases. It was not the right time, it was not the right place, however you want to interpret that. It was not right to awaken love, and they did. And so they've gone through all these obstacles. An interesting theory to explain all these obstacles, and the thing that might become relevant a bit later on, is that it's possible that the beloved is actually a foreigner. And because of that, the love between the beloved and the lover, who I take as an Israelite, is illicit and shouldn't be happening, and there's all these obstacles in the way of making it happen. There's probably no need to read too much into each of the images, but I think it's possible that her beloved is a foreigner, and there'll be a bit more evidence of that as we go along. The fourth section, chapter 3, verse 6 to 5:1, love unfitters. So we cut again to another scene without warning, and this scene starts off by looking out into the wilderness. Generally in the Bible, the wilderness is pictured as an undesirable place. So it's the place where the Israelites were forced to wander. It's the place where the scapegoat was sent into. In other Jewish literature, it's the place where the demons dwell. So in general, the wilderness is not pictured as a pleasant thing. And even more so in Song of Songs, because it is a really stark contrast to the nature imagery of animals and plants and flowers that describe the love of the lovers. In chapter 3, verse 7, when we see that it's Solomon coming up from the wilderness, or Solomon's litter, that gives us a bit of context for how to interpret Solomon. Solomon's presented in two really contrasting ways in the Old Testament. One is as the paradigm of wisdom, the wisest man that there's ever been, the king of Israel that led them through the most prosperous time of Israel. And then on the other side is as maybe the most debaucherous man that's ever been, having 700 wives and 300 concubines, or whatever the numbers were. So looking at Solomon on the backdrop of the wilderness, I think it gives us reason to understand this more as the debaucherous Solomon, not the wise one, but the one who made all the mistakes. And that also influences what we understand this song to be, because if this is in the style of Solomon, or if this is inspired by Solomon, the wilderness tells us that it's inspired by the debaucherous Solomon. And so this song isn't a song that we should exactly seek to model ourselves after or model our love after, but more as a song to be warned by and to try and stay away from and learn from the mistakes of. But there is a question. Is this picture of Solomon actually a picture of Solomon, or is it a picture of the beloved just described as Solomon? I think it's actually Solomon, making it a third person in this love triangle for two main reasons. The first one is that it uses the name Solomon. Earlier in the song, the beloved is referred to as a king, but never by the name of Solomon. And so here, when we get the name of Solomon, I think it implies that this is the actual Solomon, or the image of the actual Solomon, as far as the song goes anyway. The second thing that I think indicates this is a separate person from the beloved is that now the speaker starts to call the lover sister. If I'm right in my theory that the beloved is actually a foreigner, he actually wouldn't be able to call the lover his sister. And so the fact that this person does call her sister indicates to me that this is a separate person. And consistently, the only time that she's called sister is in this section, except for one time, which I'll explain when we get to it. But basically, Solomon uses the word sister to speak of the lover over and over again, but the beloved doesn't use that of her. So putting that all together, I do think that this is Solomon and that it's separate from the beloved. And then from chapter 4, Solomon starts to speak to the lover. And he uses words that are really familiar to the reader because they're words that sound really similar to what the beloved said. And it contains all that nature imagery. And he expresses to her his desire, his physical desire for the lover. And what happens in verse 16 of chapter 4 is that the lover, who has awakened her desire with her beloved previously, although now is separated from him, she now awakens her love again with Solomon. So verse 16, awake north wind, and come south wind, blow on my garden. And taking into account all that nature imagery that we've been going through, I think it's a pretty clear indication that she is physically fulfilling her desires with Solomon now. And so instead of saying don't awake, which we've heard twice before now, she says the exact opposite. Awake north wind and come south wind. The fifth section, chapter 5, verse 2 to 16, love returns. Again, we cut to a different scene in chapter 5, verse 2. The lover is now sleeping in her bed, but it says, I slept, but my heart was awake. And so we get this picture that the lover's awakened love isn't done. Once it's awakened, it's hard to control. The beloved is now at the door and he says, open to me, my sister, my love. Now, this is the one time that the beloved actually uses the word sister. But what I think is happening is this is her dream of the perfect situation with her beloved. So her beloved returns to her and is able to call her sister. In verse 4, when she hears this, it says her heart was thrilled within her. But when she gets to the door in verse 6, she finds that her beloved is actually not there. And so she goes out into the city and she searches, a lot like she did before, but this time she doesn't find him. Often this section is interpreted as a dream. It's not super clear what part is a dream or not, or if it's a dream at all, but I think the context of this being a dream does make some sense. If it is a dream, I think it's a picture of her ideal life with her beloved. It would be a life where her beloved isn't separated from her by all these obstacles, but actually able to call her sister, as in he's a fellow Israelite. So love returns, but not in a happy sense. It returns because once love is awakened, it's just hard to control, and it's hard to tame, kind of can't be stopped. The sixth section, chapter 6, verse 1 to 8, verse 4, love dies. So we ended the last section with the lover searching for the beloved and not finding him. But we start this section with the lover knowing exactly where he is. And this is probably the hardest section for anyone with a story perspective of Song of Songs to explain. If you don't think Song of Songs is a cohesive story, you can just say this is a separate song. But if you think there's some sort of cohesion between it, this part is very tricky to understand. The way I think makes the most sense to understand this is that at this point, between the end of chapter 5 and the start of chapter 6, there's a break in the story. If you remember from before, I said I think the context of the song is the lover speaking to the daughters of Jerusalem and not to the beloved. And how I think that applies here is that up to the end of chapter 5, the lover's been telling the story to the daughters of Jerusalem from the perspective of within the story, as in, this happened to me and then that happened to me. And now here at chapter 6, it kind of jumps to her telling the story from the perspective of after it's all happened. Again, in this section, it's the beloved and the lover speaking to each other, telling each other how much they love each other. The beloved will say things like, how beautiful you are and pleasing, my love, with your delights. That's chapter 7, verse 6. And then the lover says, let's go out to the vineyards and see whether the vines have budded. That's chapter 7, verse 12. So she's still telling the daughters of Jerusalem the story, using the words of the lover and the beloved, but now it's being told from a different perspective. And that's kind of reflected in the language that's used as well. So there's still some garden imagery, but now the beloved's words are filled with army imagery, and the lover's words are filled with regret. The beloved says that the lover's now awesome as an army with banners. And while you can get the kind of glorious description he has of her, at the same time, there's this strange struggle in the words. How is his lover like an army with banners? How is she glorious in that way? It's a bit strange. And the lover says, "Oh, that you were like a brother to me." And that kind of harkens back to how Solomon was able to call her sister, but the beloved could only call her sister in her dreams, because in reality, he was a foreigner, or at least I think he was a foreigner. And so we get again, at the end of this section, the warning to the daughters of Jerusalem to not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. So trying to put all of that together, there's a break in the story now, and she's not kind of telling it in real time, but she's telling it with the distance of time. She's telling it from after she's experienced all these things and looking back on it. And so her words kind of change from garden imagery that really just express the intensity of their love to imagery with armies and war and regret. And so the story that the lover tells is a story of love that's never really been able to come together. Maybe for moments, but not how she truly desires. And maybe the lover also speaks veiledly about the beloved having died. And this is really reading into it, so I wouldn't put too much weight on this. But the lover describes the beloved as going down to his garden. Chapter 7, verse 1. And that word down, in Hebrew, yerad, is to descend. And often, when it's talking about humans descending, it's associated with death. So that happens in the Psalms, that happens in Job, in Jonah as well. There's kind of this either actual death or metaphorical death that's associated with. Normally, though, it would say something like going down to the pit, going down to Sheol, or something like that. Here it says going down to his garden. So there's a very slight hint that possibly in this story that she's telling, it's the description of his death and how he was caught up in possibly a physical war that paralleled the metaphorical war of their love. That, I think, is an interesting theory. There's not tons of evidence for it. There's kind of a few scatterings that you can put it together from. So I'm just throwing it out there as an interesting idea. It's clearly about them being separated and not being able to come back together, possibly because of his death. And then the final section, chapter 8, verse 5 to 8:14, love teaches. In this section, in verse 5, we return to the wilderness. But this time it's not Solomon coming up from the wilderness. It's actually the lover and her beloved coming up from the wilderness. Again, a lot of people view this as a kind of sweet picture of the two growing old together, because the lover's leaning on her beloved. But I think the picture of the wilderness indicates that we should read this a bit more negatively or a bit more sadly. The picture of the garden is gone, so there's no life, there's no love between the two. And so I think this is looking at the story of the lover and her beloved through the lens of regret. In verse 5 it says, "Under the apple tree I awakened you, there your mother was in labour with you." And I think this is a memory of the first time they awakened their love together. And in the context of the wilderness, I think this is a bittersweet memory. So while she loves the beloved with all her heart, she's also filled with regret because of all the pain that this love has brought. And that word awakened comes up again, this time not as a warning like it has before, or as a call to awaken love, but as a regretful memory. And it's regretful because their love's not over. Whether they're just separated or he's actually died, their love's not over. It says, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy is as fierce as the grave. Even though the beloved has possibly died, the lover's love is not quenched in any way. But then neither can it ever be fulfilled. And so it's filled with pain. And so at the end of this section, the daughters of Jerusalem ask, what shall we do with this young sister that we have? And from her hard-won wisdom, the lover says, if she is a wall, we'll build onto her a battlement of silver. And if she's a door, we'll enclose her with boards of cedar. Which, in the context of this kind of painful song, is saying, no matter this young sister's attitude to love, whether she's prone to awakening love or prone to not awakening love, whatever her situation, we need to bolster her even more against awakening love. Because look at all this pain that I've had to live through, look at all this regret that I now have. Her lesson from that is to not awaken love for this new generation. And the song ends with two really ambiguous verses. The beloved says, let me hear your voice, in verse 13. And the lover says, make haste, be like a gazelle. Despite all this pain and all this separation and the fact that the last couple of chapters have revealed that they can't ever be together, you still have the beloved longing to hear the lover's voice, and you still have the lover calling the beloved to come over those mountains like a gazelle. But it'll never happen. And that's the sad story of Song of Songs, I think. That love awakened before it desires does not lead to good things. So I've taken a pretty direct interpretation of Song of Songs. And in doing that, you might wonder how this connects to God, because there's no obvious connection. There's no temple, there's no Torah, there's no Messiah, there's no promise of restoration or of a new covenant or of sacrifices or anything like that. But I think in its imagery, there are some really interesting connections that we can make. I won't explain how I think it connects, but if you're interested in exploring it on your own, I think it's interesting to think about the imagery of the garden versus wilderness and what that's meant for God's people, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. I think it's interesting to look at the imagery of the cities that we get more towards the end of Song of Songs, particularly the mention of the city of Jerusalem and the city of Tirzah. And then also interesting to look at the spices, which is a bit more random, but there's some interesting spices that are connected to the love of the lover and beloved. And those spices are also connected really closely to the sacrificial system. And thinking about how that imagery is used in Song of Songs, but also has a very deep connection, a rich connection to God himself. So I've taken a pretty direct interpretation of Song of Songs. And so summing all of that up, there's lots more interesting details in this book that make it a really fascinating book to read and to ponder. But basically, it's the story of intense love and physical desire that was awakened before its time. And what it teaches us is that when that is awakened before its time, it becomes really hard to control. And there's all sorts of consequences that start to come from that. And awakening love in one situation seems to, at least in this case, lead to awakening love in other situations, which only compounds the problem. And then you start to see that awakened love can't be tamed in the end. Love awakened before its time is shown to be broken and painful and filled with regret. And so Song of Songs, I don't think, is a picture of holy love, but it does function to call its readers and its listeners to a holy love. Really interestingly, it doesn't tell us exactly when or where or how to awaken love when it desires. It just makes us want to seek it, which is a characteristic of biblical wisdom literature, I think. And so it's got a really clear story, it's got a really clear message, but it forces you to ponder how that might play out in your life.